They called it The Hunt for Red October and sold it as fiction, but the question behind the story was deadly serious. Could a Soviet submarine captain ever really steal his boat, sail past the reach of Moscow, and hand the whole machine, crew, secrets and all, over to the West? For decades, intelligence officers, admirals, and armchair historians have gone looking for a real-world Red October. What they've found instead is something more complicated and, in its own way, even more dramatic. The short answer is that no Soviet submarine ever successfully defected to America as a unit. There was no moment when a ballistic missile boat popped up alongside a U.S. carrier group, raised a white flag, and asked for asylum. What did happen were two very different kinds of escapes. Once, in the middle of World War II, a single man nearly gave an entire Soviet submarine to Hitler's navy, only to be outplayed by his own captain and left bobbing alone in the enemy's sights. Later, during the Cold War, individual sailors made desperate jumps from Soviet decks to American ones, betting that if they could just get their hands on a U.S. rail or a merchantman's ladder, they could trade the world of ration cards and suspicion for one of radar screens, coffee machines, and a flag that said United States Coast Guard. To understand why a Red October-style defection never really happened, you have to grasp how seriously the Soviet state took the idea that its most powerful ships might one day turn around. Submarines were the crown jewels of Soviet sea power, especially the ones with nuclear missiles. Their crews were hand-picked, not just for technical skill, but for political reliability. Service beneath the waves was elite. It went to those who had passed layer after layer of ideological screening, psychological testing, and loyalty checks. On top of that, every major warship carried a political officer, the Zampolit, whose job was to monitor morale and ideology and to veto any order that smelled like treason. There was also the simple fact of how tightly the Soviet Navy watched its own assets. Submarines on patrol followed prearranged communication schedules. Abrupt changes of course, unexplained radio silence, or any sign that a boat was heading for the wrong coastline could trigger alarms up and down the chain of command. When Soviet leaders even suspected that a ship might be slipping out of their control, they were willing to do almost anything to stop it. In 1975, when the anti-submarine frigate Storozhevoy broke formation in the Baltic under the control of a radical political officer and turned its bow toward the open sea, the reaction was immediate and violent. Dozens of Soviet warships and aircraft were scrambled. Long-range bombers armed with anti-ship missiles were sent to intercept. Some pilots refused to fire missiles at a Soviet flag outside Soviet waters, but others dropped conventional bombs so close that they crippled the frigate's steering, forcing it into circles barely 50 miles short of Swedish territory. Special forces boarded, the mutiny was suppressed, and its leader, Valery Sablin, was executed. The lesson for every officer who heard the story was simple. If you try to take a Soviet combat vessel to the West, the Soviet Union will throw its entire fleet at you, and it is prepared to sink you if that's what it takes. That same logic applied under the surface. When the Soviet diesel boat S-363, known in the West as U-137, ran aground deep inside Swedish territorial waters in 1981, a crisis was almost surreal. Here was a Soviet submarine stuck on the rocks just a few miles from a NATO country's main naval base at Karlskrona. For 10 days, Swedish ships and Soviet rescue forces stared each other down. Later, the boat's political officer claimed that he and his captain had orders to destroy the submarine and, if necessary, themselves, rather than allow it to be boarded and inspected by Western divers. Whether every detail of that claim is technically accurate or not, it fits a consistent pattern. To Moscow, the idea of an intact submarine falling into Western hands was so intolerable that losing ship and crew was an acceptable price to avoid it. Against that backdrop, it's easier to see why a full crew submarine escape was almost impossible, and why, when Soviet sailors did break away, they tended to do it alone. But long before the Cold War reached its peak, the Soviet Navy had already come dangerously close to losing a submarine to the enemy, from the inside. The year was 1943. The place was the Gulf of Finland, one of the most heavily mined and closely watched pieces of water on the planet. The submarine was Shah 303, nicknamed Shuka, under the command of Captain Ivan Trovkin. Its mission was bleak and simple: slip through German and Finnish anti-submarine defenses and reach the open Baltic to hunt enemy shipping. The odds were terrible. The Germans had laid thick minefields and stretched anti-submarine nets across the narrowest points. Patrol boats and listening stations scoured the approaches day and night. Soon after leaving Kronstadt, the Shah 303 brushed against a moored mine, a shuddering impact that, by sheer luck, did not detonate. The crew members knew exactly how close they had just come to ending up an oil slick and a column of bubbles. For days on end, they crept along the bottom, surfacing only when absolutely necessary and only at night to charge batteries and refresh the stale air inside. At the mouth of the Gulf, they discovered that the Germans had closed the entire exit with a double anti-submarine net from shore to shore. It was as if someone had put a lid on the sea. Life aboard grew unbearable. The hull rang regularly with the distant thump of depth charges. Fresh water and fuel ran low. Men slept in shifts wherever they could find space, their nerves frayed by the constant threat of mines and sonar pings. Among them was a petty officer named Boris Galkin, the leader of a technical team. His shipmates would later describe him as coarse, unable to make friends, and prone to losing his head under pressure. On May 21, 1943, Galkin went on duty in the central control compartment around noon. In the adjacent radio room, operators and acoustic specialists strained to make out sounds from the world outside the steel shell. 3 hours into his watch, an acoustic operator reported the noise of numerous propellers, a convoy or a hunter-killer group passing by. The duty officer left his station briefly to report to Captain Trovkin. In that moment, Galkin made his move. He locked the doors to the radio room. He plunged the central compartment into darkness by switching off the lights. Then, crucially, he opened the valves that fed high-pressure air into the ballast tanks, the system submarines use to blow water out and rise rapidly in the middle of enemy-controlled waters. Without warning or authorization, the Shah 303 started to shoot toward the surface in the middle of enemy-controlled waters. By the time Trovkin fought his way back to the control room and scrambled up the conning tower hatch, the damage was done. The submarine had broken the surface inside a ring of German and Finnish warships, some of them just 30 meters away, guns already swiveling toward the unexpected target. And on the bridge, waving a makeshift white flag fashioned from a pillowcase, stood Boris Galkin. There was no accident to explain here, no malfunction. When the captain demanded to know what had happened, Galkin reportedly shouted that he couldn't take it anymore and that they were going to die anyway. His solution, clearly, was to surrender the submarine, boat, crew, and secrets and all, to the enemy, in the hopes of saving his own skin. In one rash decision, he had come closer than any Soviet submarine sailor before or since to handing an intact Soviet sub to a hostile power. Trovkin found himself on an open bridge, unarmed, surrounded by enemy steel, with a mutinous petty officer at his side and his entire command staring down the barrels of German guns. There was no time for a lecture on loyalty. What he did instead was pure Cold War thriller decades before Tom Clancy put pen to paper. He pretended to go along. Evidence accounts say the captain began shouting toward the nearest German vessel, gesturing wildly as if inviting negotiations, buying seconds as the enemy prepared a boarding party. Seeing what they thought was a reasonable surrender, the Germans started lowering a boat. At that moment, Trovkin gave the order. The Shah 303's main ballast was blown again, this time to dive, and the submarine plunged back under the waves, leaving Galkin alone on the surface, clutching his white flag. German guns opened fire, hammering the water and striking the sub as it slid downstairs. Damage reports later showed scars and bent metal, but no fatal breaches. Pounded and shaken, the Shah 303 abandoned any hope of reaching the Baltic and crept back towards Soviet waters. On June 8, 1943, it limped into Kronstadt, battered but alive. Galkin, meanwhile, was hauled out of the water by the very navy he had tried to join as a prisoner. Taken into German custody, he chose to collaborate. At one point, he was brought to a camp to try to persuade another captured Soviet submarine captain, Sergei Lissin of the S-7, to switch sides. Lissin refused. In later Russian accounts, Galkin appears as the only Soviet sailor to defect from a submarine, not because he succeeded in taking the boat with him, but because he tried. For your American audience, there's a bitter irony in that story. In 1943, the Nazis and the Soviets were both totalitarian regimes with fearsome security services. A man like Galkin, looking up at a ring of German barrels and down at a steel tube full of exhausted comrades, decided the best bet was to quit on his own country. Captain Travkin's snap decision, trust the crew, not the panicked petty officer, trust Soviet steel and seamanship over German promises, saved the Shah 303. But the episode left a deep scar in naval culture. It showed just how close internal betrayal could come to handing over one of the state's most precious weapons platforms. It also taught Moscow a lesson it never forgot. Build procedures so tight that no single man can ever do what Galkin did again. By the time the Cold War reached its height, that lesson had been applied ruthlessly. Submarine crews were vetted, watched, and drilled. Political officers kept tabs on conversations as much as on charts. Incidents like the Storage Avoy mutiny and the U-137 grounding only reinforced the paranoia. Once you see Soviet bombers dropping ordnance on their own ship to stop a suspected defection towards Sweden, you understand why no captain ever tried to repeat Galkin's stunt with a nuclear sub. And yet, the desire to get out did not disappear. It just scaled down. If you could not take the submarine with you, maybe you could at least take yourself. In November 1970, a Lithuanian named Simas Kudirka found himself on the deck of a Soviet fishing vessel, the Sovietskaya Litva, Soviet Lithuania, tied up alongside a United States Coast Guard cutter, USCGC Vigilant, in U.S. territorial waters off New England. Officially, the encounter was a routine meeting to discuss fishing rights. Unofficially, for one man, it was an opening. Kudirka had grown up under Soviet rule in Lithuania and served for years in the Soviet fishing fleet. Like many in the Baltic republics, he never accepted the loss of his country's independence. He listened secretly to Western radio, heard tales of life in America, and nursed the thought that if the chance ever came, he would run. That chance arrived when the Sovietskaya Litva's officers boarded the Vigilant to negotiate. Shortly afterward, under some pretext, Kudirka was allowed to join them on the American ship's deck. Surrounded by U.S. sailors and officers, standing on metal-painted Coast Guard gray instead of Soviet green, he realized he was physically on American territory. Witnesses recall that he suddenly broke away, ran, and leapt from the Soviet trawler's deck onto the Vigilant, grabbing on and hauling himself over the side. Breathless, he declared his intention to defect. What happened next has gone down as one of the most disgraceful episodes in U.S. maritime history. The officers on the Vigilant had no clear standing orders for such a situation. Confused, worried about provoking an incident, and lacking the moral clarity that would later be written into policy, they hesitated. Soviet officers demanded his man back. Incredibly, the Americans allowed a Soviet boarding party onto the Vigilant. Right there, on a U.S. government vessel flying the American flag, Soviet sailors beat Kudirka bloody, tied him up, and dragged him back across the gap to the Sovietskaya Litva. For the Kremlin, it was a propaganda gift and an opportunity for revenge. In May 1971, a Soviet court sentenced Kudirka to 10 years in forced labor camps. He disappeared into the network of prisons and camps in regions like Pskov and Mordovia, paying the price for the few minutes he had spent on an American deck. For many in the U.S., the shame came later when the press and Congress realized what their own officers had allowed. The outcry was so intense that Washington rewrote the rulebook. From then on, Coast Guard and Navy commands were given clear directives never to hand back someone seeking asylum from a communist regime. Then, something happened that the Soviets had not counted on. Kudirka's mother turned out to have been born in the United States. That technicality meant she, and by extension her son, had a claim to U.S. citizenship. As the case became a human rights cause célèbre in the West, pressure on Moscow mounted. In 1974, several years before his sentence was due to end, the Soviet authorities quietly released him. The United States granted him entry. The man who had once been thrown off an American cutter was now flying to New York with a visa, and soon, official status. When you imagine that arrival, remember how different his new world must have looked and felt. He had lived his adult life in cramped Soviet ships and Spartan Baltic apartments, queuing for basic goods. Now he walked into American airports with moving walkways, fluorescent lighting, and departure boards listing flights to dozens of cities. He took trains and cars through landscapes crisscrossed with interstate highways and high-voltage lines. He shopped in supermarkets where the dairy aisle alone held more variety than an entire Lithuanian market town. The same country whose ship had once failed him now overwhelmed him with machines and freedoms he had only heard about through static on Radio Free Europe. Kudirka eventually became a U.S. citizen, spoke out against Soviet rule in Lithuania, and, after his homeland regained independence, returned there as a symbol of resistance and survival. His story is not just about the moment of the jump, it's about the realization on both sides of what it meant for a man raised in the Soviet system to risk everything to reach the deck of an American ship, and about how once he finally made it to the U.S., that system proved capable of absorbing him, giving him work, rights, and a standard of living far beyond anything he had known. He was not the only one to aim for Western steel. In December 1962, reports out of India told of another Soviet sailor, Vlad Stepanovich Tarasov, who had taken a similar path. According to dispatches cited by the New York Times, Tarasov slipped out of a porthole on a Soviet merchant ship in an Indian port, dropped into the water, and swam for a nearby American vessel. Soaked and exhausted, he hauled himself aboard and asked for asylum. This time, the U.S. response was different. Having learned from incidents like Kudirka's, Washington quickly signaled to New Delhi that it was prepared to grant Tarasov asylum. Soviet protests were noted, but not obeyed. Cases like Tarasov's rarely made the front pages for long. They played out in the quiet lanes of foreign ministries and the restricted compartments of intelligence cables. But each one added another tiny crack to the facade of unity that Moscow tried to project. Here were men in Soviet uniforms or on Soviet ships who, the moment they had the chance, swam toward American flags. When you put all these stories together, the panic of Boris Galkin on the Shah 303, the fury of Soviet admirals at the Storozhevoy, the cold determination to blow up U-137 rather than let it be captured, the desperate jumps of Kudirka and Tarasov, you get a clearer picture of what submarine escapes actually meant in the Cold War. Not sleek captains calmly steering a nuclear boat into an American harbor, but ordinary men caught between two systems trying to navigate the narrow gap between treason and survival. From the American point of view, Their choices say something important. No one risked everything to get into a Soviet submarine. People risked everything to get out of one or off a Soviet deck and onto American hardware. They ran toward cutters whose radars, radios, and engines were the product of an economy that could afford to put reliable electronics and plentiful spare parts even on a mid-sized patrol vessel. They sought asylum in a country that, for all its flaws, could take a Lithuanian fisherman or a nameless sailor from a Black Sea freighter and, within a few years, hand him a passport, a car, and a life in a town with color televisions in the windows. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders at sea had to worry not just about NATO planes and American attack submarines, but about their own men looking for openings. They ringed their most sensitive boats with procedures, political officers, and, if necessary, orders to destroy their own ships rather than let them fall into Western hands. That level of fear was itself a confession that on a long enough timeline, given enough cracks in the armor, the attraction of the other side's freedom and technology could prove stronger than any party oath. There was never a real Red October, but there were real Boris Galkins, Simas Kadirkas, and Vladis Tarasovs, men whose actions at sea forced both superpowers to show what they were really made of. The Soviet Union responded with bombs on its own ships and 10-year sentences in labor camps. The United States, after stumbling, responded with new rules to protect future defectors, ships that welcomed them aboard, and cities whose skylines of antennas, neon, and interstates made it obvious why someone would swim through cold, dark water just to stand under an American flag.